as part of the climate group for Latin America of the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, I'd like to thank our colleagues from the Manila office for having included us in this series of climate dialogues or dialogues on climate justice. Of course, we'd also like to express our gratitude to the three panelists, Carolina Amaya, Martín Vilela, and Vanessa González, for making valuable contributions from the different Latin American territories. And last but not least, I'd like to thank you, the audience, who are joining us over Zoom or the other social media networks. And with this, I'd like to hand over to Laura Geiger. She is the director for the Climate Justice Program in the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, and she will give us a short introduction into the purpose of these dialogues, of this series of dialogues, and she will also give some information about activities in the area of climate justice all over the world. So with this, I hand over the floor to you, Laura.
Thank you, Carla, for the introduction. Good morning again and buenos dias to everyone. My name is Laura Geiger, and as Carla said, I'm the director of the Climate Justice Program of the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, based so far in Manila in the Philippines. And that was also the reason why we started these dialogues also in Asia. As Carla mentioned, this is a part of a series. We started in Asia, we had an African dialogue, and now we have the Latin American dialogue. So we are really happy that our LS colleagues around the world were so engaged in this topic, and it has shown that this definitely is an important topic, even though it is not sufficiently discussed so far. So why actually is RLS interested in this topic? As I said, it is often forgotten, and sometimes we call it, it's a little bit like an orphan issue. So climate migrants are recognized, but in the international settings and negotiation, it is not enough discussed. And also because of that, there are not enough frameworks regarding this issue. So it's a crucial issue, when not even one of the most crucial issues under the climate change discussions. So if you look at the international discussion where we are, for example, the UNFCCC, there we have some negotiations around loss and damages, but that focuses mainly on climate change, but the discussion is stuck in budgets and numbers and money, and the question still remains: who's going to pay and who will be paid for what exactly? Then we have the Global Compact on Refugees, but this, as the name also says, they focus on refugees, and it's not really clear, especially for climate migrants. Is it climate migrants? There's a big discussion. Do we define that as climate migrants and refugees? Because with this comes also a different set of rights. And then the third one I would like to mention is a Global Compact for Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration, the GCM. And they recognize climate change definitely as a driver for migration. And it's also their mandate actually to protect the rights of those displaced. But the question also remains if it's enough space provided there to discussions, to give the space to discuss actually to the extent it should be, to really ensure certain rights for climate migrants. So we're in the process, and actually it's a really interesting time at the moment, because there is an open window where the GCM gives the opportunity to governments, but also communities to, or encourage actually communities to submit their demands and necessities. And we would like to engage you also in this. And this is something where I will say a few words more at the end of that discussion. Just to give you 2 or 3 points of the main important remarks from the previous sessions we had. What was raised from the panelists, but also from the participants, that it's actually, it is not a choice for migrating. It is often people are forced, and we should be aware of this. This is it's a threat, and it's not a matter of if you would like to go or not. Another really important issue was that extractivism, even though we talk about climate migration, that we sometimes should maybe open up a little bit also the definition, or also what we consider, what are the consequences of extractivism, which of course is related to climate change, but then also how we define it, or how do we call this? Are these climate migrants, climate refugees, or even ecological refugees? So what's the difference? There was a little bit a need for more reflection on that from the previous discussion. And then actually one also point which came back again and again, that this really we should create and offer the space to give communities the space to speak out and find a way also even for international organizations and frameworks to be heard. And this is again, coming back to what I just mentioned, resonates very much with the possibility to submit something for the UN under the GCM. But yeah, how this in detail can happen, I will say a few more things at the end. And for now, I wish us all a really good, fruitful discussion. Thanks.
Gracias, Laura. Bueno, pues de nuevo con este antecedente.
Thanks, Laura. It's very important to see that this series of dialogues is very important, and it's wonderful that we've been invited by the Office of Manila, because we can provide a different Southern perspective. We can make reference to different geographical regions, different conditions under which we live. And apart from that, we share a colonial past. We've been influenced sharply by colonialist activities, which is closely linked to looting, plunder, and the exploitation of the workforce, of workers. So to this context of colonialism, we are now adding the phenomenon of climate change, which is a clear consequence of the capitalist system of consumption, which can be found mainly in the north of our planet. It's closely linked to extractivism, to cultural and environmental and economic conditions of the world in general, but basically it's the southern part of the globe that most severely feels the impacts. And this is part of the claims or demands of climate justice. This is a key issue. We have to understand that the climate migration can be somewhat tricky to define or to really classify according to certain schemes, because migrants in Latin America are not only climate migrants, they may also unite different features such as economic migrants and so on. So we have to understand the definition in order to also discuss their access to certain rights. So in order to also be better at that, we have to make visible the structures of exploitation that are linked to looting, to extractivism, and to the fact that people are forced to migrate. And we are seeing that these structures sometimes even exist within communities. For instance, when we look at gender relations, I'm not going to go into detail here. I just want to briefly present our panelists that we invited. And after that, I'll give you some more details. We have here Carolina Amaya. She is from the Unidad Ecológica de El Salvador and from the Foro Centroamérica Vulnerable. And we also have here Martín Vilela. He is a member of the global campaign to demand climate justice and of the Latin American Platform for Climate Justice. And then we also have Vanessa González, the national coordinator of migrants in Chile and the spokeswoman of the Movement for Water and the Territories. And we're really grateful to have you here. And we can start with their contributions. And we'll start with Carolina. She is an activist for the environmental movement in El Salvador, and from her organization in the past 20 years has given guidance and accompanied many communities in their struggle for their territories and the protection of their regions and territories. And she is of the National Alliance Against the Privatization of Water and other organizations. And she wants to generate environmental policies and has helped to set up respective structures. Carolina, we'll start with you, and maybe you can give us some information about the context in Central America, where we have environmental vulnerability, structural violence, poverty, and environmental degradation that is exacerbating. Where are the elements that help us to understand this migrant phenomenon? So that's one of the questions. And then the second one is how these different conditions and phenomena affect women.
Gracias, Carlita. Antes de abordar.
Thank you so much, Carla. And before talking about climate, I also want to give you a broader context, for example, about droughts and other natural disasters that particularly strike Central America. So what do we refer to? It's the so-called historical debt that after centuries of colonialism and deportation, specifically by the industrialized countries and towards nations in Latin America, and also the plundering of natural resources and the use of natural resources free of charge. So this occupation and this historical debt, if you want, does exist. And then these three slides at the bottom, you can't see very well, maybe. So you can see that is a map of Honduras with 4 different municipalities and also the different administrative units. So you can see the 25 different districts with a lot of extractivism going on, for example, mining of hard coal and other resources. So this in general makes us susceptible and vulnerable to different phenomena. You can see also in the center that the mining or the extraction is going on by the first world countries. And you can see on the right-hand side that, for example, one of these companies is using double the amount of water than a community of 1.6 million people in El Salvador. And you can see also that the use of water, also the use of sugarcane, banana, and other crops, that many of these crops are not being consumed within the country, in the economy, but are being exported. So we can indeed speak of a historical debt, and here we add to this historical debt also the carbon debt, if you want, that has also an impact on the same space, and that we might as well continue along the same lines, saying that historically this has been perpetrated by the industrialized nations, and historically in a very concentrated way. So this very disproportionate pollution has caused damage to the ozone layer, and also to the rise of the greenhouse gases being emitted. So countries like United States, European countries, Canada, Russia. So just for you to have an idea, where should we put our focus, and what do we mean when we speak about resistance and carbon footprint? So this huge void, if you want, in the capitalist system, exploiting or based on extractivism as if it was an infinite model, but then this clashes, of course, because the resources are finite. In order to understand this over-exploitation of nature, of the territories, and we have really exceeded our limits already. And we can see that in 2015, we would have needed 1.7 planets. But today, I think we need even more than 7 times more fossil fuels than back in 1945. So we have really crossed these boundaries and limits, and we live beyond the biocapacities of our planet. So it's really not about living, but about surviving, and to bear in mind the common good when we think of our planet. So when we think about extreme droughts, for example, or floodings, these natural disasters are hitting us frequently and regularly. So, for example, between 2000 and 2016, a wave of droughts. In 2018, for example, 60% of all the crops had been lost because of these natural disasters. And today, as we speak, for example, a hurricane again is affecting 3.7 million people in the region. And is this really a terrible threat to, for example, the population in Nicaragua? So it is indeed, there are historical examples in the recent past, so we can see that this is going on. And speaking about migration, this forced displacement or forced migration can, of course, also be expressed in a mobility index, if you want. So entire populations that have been, whose livelihoods have been undermined and threatened. And so these people have been displaced, have been criminalized, have been killed partly, have been expelled from their territories, and that this is really a matter of trying to survive. Thinking of Mexico and the Institute of Migration, there are the figures of last year that you can see, statistics. For example, in Honduras, not because, well, Honduras is basically the nation that is mostly migrating to Mexico, but also Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua. And there are also pictures at the bottom that would look familiar to you, I assume. So I have 2 minutes left, so I have to be quick. So if poverty has a face, migration has a face as well. So I can show you this survey from Guatemala from last year that puts in relation women and migration, so that women, of course, with the role that they have, and to also support the families. So that has an impact on the entire family. They are migrating to the rural areas towards the center of the country. And there is a direct relation also between women's migration and food insecurity. So we can say that the climate crisis is adding to that problem, and that it's not just a migration, it's really a forced migration because of all these factors and the impacts that we've just talked about. And the last slide is confirming that, yes, there is an international system which is working. There are meetings, but indeed it has failed if we take a closer look. Because if we take a look back at 1994, the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, and then a series of accords, protocols. I mean, there's enough protocols, but there is not enough will, political will, really, to act upon it. So if we take a look at the Paris Accord, for example, we are still far away from the 2 centigrades or even 1.5 centigrades. So in 2019, for example, the next accord, so we don't know whether we will be able to live up to it or not. And if the temperature rises and we miss the target of 2.0 centigrades, then no adaptation will be possible. So it's really a lot of insecurity for our future, but the certainty maybe being that if the developments go on like that, migration will aggravate as well. And the face of this migration, this poverty, are the women who have to bear the most severe burden of these developments, and that they can, of course, also contribute to looking after their children and their families. But it's the same women who have, who are the victims, but these problems have been created. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, Carolina. And I believe that the journey that you've taken us to, and also the news of the last weeks that we've heard, the impacts, particularly what's going on in Central America, Nicaragua, Honduras, for example, the countries you've mentioned, with terrible figures that you've mentioned as well, people being affected by these impacts. So thank you for illustrating this long history of looting and plundering and extractivism. So these very extreme phenomena which leads to territories being really eroded and a very critical situation. So on an international level, of course, also, but Central America in particular is a little bit like the seed, and that we hope that we can put an emphasis on this region, and particularly also on the issue of women. Thank you so much, Carolina, for your contribution. So, and we will talk about that in more detail later on, but now I would like to introduce our next panelist, and that's Martin Vilela. He's a researcher and activist in the field of climate justice, and he's been working about water management, for example, and has carried out investigations in political sciences and has worked towards strengthening organizations and campaigns in the field. So then, for example, the negotiations of the UNFCCC, and also he's the director in the field of climate justice. He's now working in the Bolivian platform Campaña Global para Demandar, Justicia, Climática. And so warm welcome, Martin. And in this very context that we've listened to the Central American history, and that probably holds true for the rest of the continent as well. But could you tell us maybe, are there personal efforts to improve the living conditions for these communities when we think about this? Take into account the historical context of colonialism, extractivism, not only at a global level, but as Carolina said, also this link between the different states. So we'd be happy if you could share with us your thoughts on that, and after that, if you could tell us how this campaign, this climate justice campaign, takes into account these efforts, particularly in the communities, in the work on the ground. So, because the people on the ground who are suffering the direct consequences of climate change and migration. So the floor is yours, Martin.
Thanks so much, Carla. And also, thank you very much to the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation for giving us the space to speak. This is absolutely necessary. We have to promote this type of dialogue to really get climate justice. And we are also seeing that time is running out, and we have to share the valuable experiences that we've made so far. Latin America and the Caribbean is strongly influenced and impacted by extreme weather events. We're seeing this when we look at the latest hurricanes, and that is true for the entire continent. What I'd like to do is to also stress some things that Carolina has already mentioned, but also look at the Bolivian experience. And I think that really serves to show where our climate justice narrative lies and how we can really together improve our proposals and our ideas together. I'm going to share my screen. Let me just know whether that works. Apparently it does. So what we're currently seeing in the Andean region and the Amazon region is a heat wave that we haven't seen in the last 18 years, with record temperatures all over the country. Many communities are really seeing an unseen heat wave with very strong implications for the communities. Livestock is dying. We are seeing an upsurge in water levels, for instance, or a fall in water levels. And we're seeing forest fires, especially in the tropical forests. I would like to speak a little bit about climate justice, making reference to Bolivia. We think that the underlying problem is a development model which is increasing this imbalance, this environmental imbalance that we have. And this development model is basically managed by the states themselves. And these states have a capacity and a responsibility. And what they do is they generate and introduce measures and policies that lead to more extractivism, more consumption, and more environmental deterioration and destruction. Now, this is an international scenario, and Carolina has also referred to that, has as a result an increase in the multiple factors that promote migration, especially in Latin American countries or in general the global South. So what these policies do is they promote consumption, the increase in CO2, environmental degradation, climate change, and that comes along with a very strong package of curtailing people's rights. And the impact is that there is a market that regulates the environmental protection and at the same time the rights of indigenous people, human rights in general. So as a result of the application of this model, we have an increase in vulnerability, especially in the poorest parts of the global population. So this is a model that simply ensures and saves the profit for the richest part, for agro-industrial corporations and other multinational corporations, and strongly affects and hurts the poorest of the poor, especially in their rights. So how can we resolve these issues? When we really want to do that, we have to speak about the state, about their accountability. What are the southern states doing? How are we really using that term global south? That's also a matter of definition. And yesterday, Carolina, when I spoke to her, she said this distinction between North and South is somewhat difficult because within the state itself, there are complex structures that we have to bear in mind and pay attention to. We have to really visualize these structures in order to make visible the historical debt that exists. And that's something that we have to achieve, fight for being paid back that historical debt, but also achieve a very fair transition, at least for the, especially for the poorest communities, to put an end to inequalities and look at the internal structures, political structures of the state that exist, because it's the states themselves that allow for these multinational corporations to safeguard their profits and protect their profits. Now, the historical debt has to do with the industrialized states, and for Bolivia, we can say that we're only responsible for 0.03% of global emissions. So as a country, we're really not accountable here. It's the huge multinational corporations which are responsible for a major share of CO2 emissions. But we're also seeing that 50% of global emissions come from 10%, the richest 10% of the population. So these are the highly industrialized countries. Now, when we look at the climate issue with regard to Bolivia, we are seeing that when we do a per capita analysis per country, we're seeing Bolivia comes in fourth. And so Bolivia has a certain amount of emissions, and that should call our attention really, because the emissions are rather high. And the major part of the emissions in Bolivia comes from the destruction of forests and our agricultural system of intensive agriculture. We've seen dramatic changes. High acreage of forests is being destroyed. 1 million hectares of forests this year, of tropical forests, have been destroyed. And of course, not all of us are responsible for that. We also have agro-industrial corporations which are accountable, and other more local enterprises or businesses which own or want to own the land. So the most important 2% of the corporations own 50% of the land. So we're seeing that this development model that I mentioned at the beginning is simply continued in Bolivia, and they are responsible for these high per capita emissions in Bolivia. And it shows a level of injustice and inequality that is really striking. We're seeing here on this slide is that most of the reforestation plans that exist are monoculture forest, economically used forest, and that is an infringement on the territories of the indigenous people. And this is also a slide that refers to energy generation, where we have huge dams in Bolivia that also come with the well-known negative environmental consequences and the impact on the indigenous people and the environmental impact that we know of. And they're being built, these dams are being built by multinational corporations. So we're just seeing that this development model that also existed in Bolivia in the past 35 years is simply being replicated or continued. What we're seeing now in the framework of COVID-19 is that the climate factors in the past have been discussed much more intensely because they led to difficulties in agricultural and fisheries production. But what we're seeing now with the lockdown, that many restrictions have been imposed on local producers, and they have opened up paths for the major producers, major manufacturers, and that is the usual suspects, the players in the global market. So the restrictions have mainly affected, let's say, the peasant community and the small producers. Now, what we're seeing on this slide is the unfair distribution of national income. We're seeing 35% is for the richest people, for the 10% of the richest people, whereas The 10% of the poorest people only own 1%. So we're really a hostage of this colonialist system, the system that was launched during colonialism. It just reproduces inequality, and we're following that system in Bolivia, and it's just a common denominator all over Latin America, and we just have to resist these factors that push people and oblige people or force people to migrate, and we seriously have to discuss a redistribution of the income and the wealth of our country. And with that, I'll finish for now.
Me parece que pones...
Thank you very much, Martin. I think that's a very important reflection about the cost or the expense that is involved in the search for an increase in GDP of a country, for instance. That could lead to indicators of certain improvements, of certain conditions to the benefit of the population. But what we're seeing is that we're simply reproducing a system that's not different. We're seeing land grabbing being continued. We're seeing the looting of our natural resources being continued, which drives away communities from their original territory, from their places of origin. So if we continue with that system of production, really serving the necessities of the global capitalist economies, we're just repeating the same old story. We're just promoting the national industries, and even though that may be a noble goal, excuse me, we're not really getting out of this economic capitalist system. So I think that's a very important point, really. And that's something that happens in the internal and national structure of a very state. And these are the differentiations and structures that you mentioned. They also exist at local level, not only at the international stage. Okay, and with this, I'd like to move on to Vanessa González. Vanessa, I'd like to just briefly present you before I give you the floor. She is a migrant woman from Venezuela and lives in Chile. She studied social psychology at the Universidad Central de Venezuela, and she's now the chair of the Coordinadora Nacional de Inmigrantes de Chile, and she's also the secretary of Migrant Women and an activist of the Movement for Water and Territories. Thanks so much for being here, Vanessa. And I do have a question to you as well. You just heard the previous contributions and the implications they have on Latin America, or climate injustice has on Latin America. Maybe you can give us more insights into the conditions of migrant people in Latin America. You are part of that community. You are seeing yourself as a migrant woman, and you are part of a platform of different organizations, migrant organizations. And I'm pretty sure that you're also reflecting on the current situation, not only with regard to economic issues, but also structural and environmental matters. So I'd like to know from you and your organization with which you do these reflections, how do you include these aspects in your world of work, or also what is happening in other countries? What are the major threats to you as migrant people, and how can you, what threats are you dealing with, and what complications are you dealing with in your work?
Thank you. Let me start with the following thoughts that this migrating effects, of course, having an impact onto thousands, millions of people every year. And I'm not only speaking not only about human communities, but also about other communities, the nature as such. So when we speak about natural degradation and the impact on nature, that we can see, of course, one of the elements being the extractivist model. So extractivism as such is, of course, leading to displacement, and without these communities sometimes don't have the opportunity to return to their places of origin, and they have to leave their countries. So these migrating communities, we who have had this experience, we know that there's this, of course, closely linked to all the elements of nature, and we have experimented and experienced that. So the peoples, the plural, many of them, these peoples, of course, do include migrants, immigrants, peasants. So it's becoming ever more obvious that these environmental issues trigger all this, and that this is the responsibility. And we can see that it's economic growth, extractivism, patriarchism, racism, that it's all coming in together for millions of people, and people who leave their countries of origin, many of them women and children, and they are being expelled because of internal conflicts, but also economic conditions that are in the region, but also globally. So on the one hand, the cultural habits, on the other hand, all the personal issues, and of course, this is all coming, these factors are coming together when we speak about displacement. Precarious conditions that have an effect to different degrees and on your body, on the community, on the territory, on the local, regional and international level. So migration is clearly bearing evidence to these political topics, and these socio-political topics are evident and dominant. So there are, of course, there's a lot of inequalities coming into play here, and the communities is that this is, of course, also triggering elements like food insecurity. So quite a few dynamics coming together locally, but globally, but particularly locally. So with a lot of force, particularly with respect to extractivism. And these different forms of extractivism are present in so many Latin American realities, different countries. And sometimes we are not aware of this link, of this relation. So now let me come to climate migration. When this element comes into play, then we can see, of course, climate change and natural phenomena that are occurring, and also environmental developments that puts entire communities at risk. So it's all a developing project, and we can see that there is this huge problem that we are kind of turning a blind eye to that, and that there is migration policy, of course, and a perspective for human rights, but these human rights are not really accessible. But there is also the rights of nature. And we know that, but at the same time, we do live in these times in Latin America, so many people being displaced because of global warming, because of deforestation, because the pollution of water, because of water crisis in general, because of economic questions, because of mining issues, extractivism, oil, and many of these issues are evident even here in Chile, and that this, of course, then also leads to contexts of violence. Extractivism doesn't really respect the rights. So we take a look at the territories, and that the rights, human rights, and also the rights of nature are being violated. And my colleagues have already explained this context very well. So climate change and what the states are doing. So this will lead us to situations in the economic, social, and political field with huge impacts onto the local economies. And then, of course, also creating irreparable damage to these communities. So that cannot be made up for anymore. So in this context, and then also the topic of today, the resistances and women. Women have, of course, historically been oppressed in terms of our body, but also our life as such. So lots of precarious influences, and also that we are basically used to sacrifice ourselves. And the violence that we've experienced means that we need to, for example, look after ourselves when we migrate in the diaspora. So whenever there is no other way out and migration is the only way, and then also, of course, phenomena like inequalities, gender inequalities. And internationally, we see that there is, of course, also a lot of women being abused and exploited when it comes to work and labor, and that we are subordinate to these mechanisms in the global market. And then the policies in place that are not helpful. So it's the women who need to stand up and counteract these conditions that are aggravating ever more. So we need to create opportunities for participation that will allow us to subsist and to look for alternatives to improve our living conditions, and to be not only this woman in the body of a migrant, but that we have an origin and we are in search of solutions. And then always also bearing in mind ecological justice, of course. Thank you. Thank you, Vanessa. So your reflection of how the groups of migrants in other territories don't only bring all their life stories and impacts that we've talked about at the beginning of this panel, but that in these territories they meet with even more restrictions and more differences that they have to cope with. difficulties when it comes to surviving. So we need to visualize all this and work on it. So we're now going to open the floor for questions, and we have already received a few questions in the Zoom chat or on Facebook, and we're going to filter them and put them in order. So thank you so much for the input of every single one of you, Carolina, Martin, and Vanessa. And I would like to invite you to think about these reflections and positions and how they could escalate when we talk about resistances that are locally organized. So in our series of panels, we want to find arguments and see what is the reality in the territories when it comes to resistance, when it comes to lobbying and representing these groups in other contexts and spaces. I know that it's difficult when thinking about, or the experience tells us that it's difficult, it's complex. And Carolina has underlined that there have been failures in the process, but we need to continue and build on these discussions and bring them to new spaces. So this is the thoughts that we should bear in mind. And now I move on to the questions, if that's okay with all of you. So the specific questions. So we're gonna move from, we're going to start with Vanessa this time, then moving on to Martin, and at the end Carolina. So turning the order around this time. So the question would be, what's wrong with when we think about migration as a tool in terms of development? Why is this a misperception? And okay, I'm reading this and translating it for myself, just bear with me. So there's also a debate and with respect to the right to migrate or not to migrate. What are your reflections with respect to that debate, bearing in mind that climate change has aggravated in all its impacts, and also the frequencies with the natural disasters and this extreme phenomena that occur. So how does that connect to the right to migrate or the right not to migrate? Very complex, of course, these questions. What was that? Whether that is a tool for development. Given it a thought, the very concept of this forum, it's basically a criticism in itself that development as a paradigm, because we have nature and then extracting from nature, and on a more general level in the territories and the communities that have to migrate, they have to leave the territories of origin, not locally, this is a global question. So they arrive in other countries being criminalized. That of course people do have the right to migrate, but they have also to have the right to be accepted in the receiving country. So it's difficult to think that we're going to continue this situation or perpetuate this crisis, in this case in Latin America, and that we need to these impulses and that the discourse that we're talking about, well, these people are being dehumanized, if you want, as soon as they are being treated that way. So the organizations that I'm committed to would, of course, say, yes, there is the right to migration, and you need to bear in mind the motivations why certain communities had to migrate or were displaced. So, and then no person is illegal or should be dehumanized, and we should not repeat the same rationale of exploitation or fall for that. So the emigrating communities, they arrive at the countries, the destinations, and then there are perspectives that we need to bear in mind that these are humans, human bodies, and migration directly uses this utilitarian approach. And because this is like a chain, a perpetuation of this exploitation. Like, for example, a workforce that are basically used as modern slaves. And we need to bear in mind that there are rights.
Thanks so much, Vanessa. We do have a question to you, Martin. And it has to do with the fact that progressive governments have not managed to put an end to the paradigms of development that we've followed so far. So with this special, let's say, reality in Bolivia, how can we then, let's say, launch a resistance, bearing in mind the history and the acts of the government that have been carried out in the past years in Bolivia? How can we increase the resistance? How can we have an impact on the national level, on the internal level of the country, with the goal of really following that idea of buen vivir, good development, and putting an end to extractivism? This, of course, has also to do with the struggles that are already going on in Bolivia. Martin. Well, thank you so much for the question. I think in Latin America, we're looking back at several years of lots of hope linked to progressive governments and women as suffering most. At least 20% less women are educated, or let's say the educational level is at least 20% lower. And of course, we have to also put a limit, really make sure that we're putting a limit. And that's something that comes automatically with the climate debate. It has to do with the fact that we're really hitting, if you like, the natural limits. We can't just use up forests as we like and natural resources as we like. There'll be a limit to that. There'll be tipping points. So, and that's something that we're seeing. We are coming to an end when it comes to our capacity to reproduce rain, for instance. And the Bolivian population is suffering from that. So if we continue with this logic of economic growth at any cost, the only impact that will have is that it'll make us more vulnerable once the climate crisis really hits. So in order to stop a social collapse, we have to carry out these very profound and deep transformations in order to really mitigate the impacts, especially in the poorest parts of the population, and also strengthen the legal basis to really ascertain human rights. Yes, Martin, that's indeed very important. Thank you very much. There is another question that is addressed to you, Carolina, and it has to do with social distancing that we all have to practice now, and COVID-19, of course. How are you strengthening the resilience or resistance of the communities? Or maybe we can put it another way. What are the biggest risks for the movements of resistance that you are confronted with in this more difficult situation due to the pandemic and social distancing that you have to carry out? Right. First of all, Carla, we have to dismantle the concepts, because we're not talking about social distancing. We're speaking about physical distancing. So physical distancing is a preventive measure, and it doesn't necessarily lead to social distancing. So we are using a different concepts, because the same concepts are made up to create a different type of understanding and also to have an impact on social cohesion. So before COVID-19 hit in January, February, we had a water crisis in the metropolitan area of San Salvador, where there was a real lack of the access to water. And then Corona hit, or COVID-19 hit. And the question is that how, as a social movement, we can still fight against the privatization of water, especially during the crisis. And we just wanted to make use really of the crisis of COVID-19 to raise awareness for our goal, namely a more sustainable and integral use of water, which also aims at really highlighting the discussion about water management and use of water and placing that at the center of the debate. That is the protection of natural goods, which definitely has priority over exploitation rights and the rights of businesses and companies. So we're simply trying to use, let's say, the upswing, the media upswing we get through COVID-19 to raise awareness towards the right to agua, the right to water, excuse me, and the right to food, the right to land, and the right to nutritional food. And especially because one of the preconditions of being affected severely by COVID-19 has to do with your immune system and healthy food. We're not going to be healthy if we keep on exploiting our nature as we are. So we're trying to link the COVID-19 debate to our purposes and goals, and that has generated two possibilities. Firstly, to have a water legislation, an act on water. We still continue with this debate even during the COVID-19 crisis. And in the framework of the Legislative Assembly, we got 56 votes for the right to nutritious food or the right to food, and we're awaiting ratification or formal approval here. So we're trying to have an influence in public policy making to accomplish a clear guarantee for these two rights and to protect the vulnerable parts of the population. Now, coming back to the risk question, this pandemic has really highlighted or stressed one thing we've warned against for a long time, and that is the management of this government in a more digital and virtual way, and this being their only way of communication and creating images. So they're just creating images, and they're creating a new, let's say, golden thread, not only in the history of San Salvador, but also other Latin American countries, that namely the digital or virtual world is the only way to govern, to exercise government, and using the social media. We find this rather dangerous, because in this society of consumers, of consumption, the need is created to be part of this digital world, because what we are being made believe is that the only real way to communicate is social media and the digital world. So that's a risk we're worried about. And then there's another thing where we thought that this is a topic that the world knows about, and that's the risk and the threats that environmental activists are faced with. In the north of Campaña, we are seeing that they are criminalized. And this happens to the extent that the exploitation of nature continues. Yesterday, the government gave permission to a very rich family of our country to build a property in a zone where we have lots of water deposits and a rather natural zone, or with a lot of conservation area. And when we see environmental activists fighting against this, they are being criminalized. This has to do with the right to information, the right to communication. And this is something that we're fighting against, where we want to protect the environmental activists. Historically, the crisis is being paid for by nature and the poor people. And we need to find an answer to this wrongdoing, to this type of mismanagement that's going on. And we're now seeing more extreme weather events that are clearly linked to the climate crisis, and that will lead to even more climate migration, but also more dispute, more fight about those, let's say, sound territories that are still left, where people want to live. And it's just the richer groups with their hegemony that have the rights to occupy these lands, which is absolutely unfair. And this has not only to do with the historical environmental crisis, but also with the current pandemic.
Muchas gracias, Carolina, tanto por esta reflexión como también por corregir esta parte.
Thank you, Carolina, for this reflection, and also for correcting some thoughts, and that this is, of course, a topic, the social and physical distancing. So we have only 5 minutes left. And I don't want to close this panel without one specific question, which is, how are we going to design the alternatives in a continental panorama? And in the frame of these resistances, how can we connect? For example, we do have the Latin American platform for climate justice, which might be the right platform to design these alternatives. So I would like to ask all of you to share a brief reflection of what's the next step? How do we get to a future scenario where we can really live these alternatives and these regional efforts? And of course, the effects will differ locally from place to place, but still, what can we do? If you could share a brief reflection on this question. And again, we go with Vanessa, and maximum 2 minutes, please.
Gracias, Carla. Bueno, yo estaba pensando en las alternativas, evidentemente hay muchas, ¿no?
Yeah, well, thinking of the alternatives, we could, of course, think or dream of other worlds and places, but I could share, for example, a thought that I, of course, am also a member of the sector of migrants, but also an environmentalist. So there are these inequalities that are in our way to ourselves, and also we as a population, then here in Chile, we're being criminalized, and we are in a way all descendants of African American populations that have been mistreated, or they have been discriminated against, and so we have been humiliated in the systems of colonialism, patriarchal structures, and then the resistances against racism and xenophobia as a migrating group of people. So then all these inequalities that we are confronted with, and that have led to us being displaced. So that we have to give a thought, and then also bear in mind our people and population that have been mistreated, and that have, I think we need to open this space and at the same time build this community and work for that. This new place is going to become a home as well, and that we have, of course, to fight at the same time this social and environmental cause as well. Thank you, Vanessa. Martin has to leave us, unfortunately.
Nos despedimos de Martín, que estás por ahí todavía.
Bueno, Martin, bye-bye. Thank you very much for inviting me to this space, and I think we will continue designing these answers and solutions, and in solidarity from the perspective of our populations, and that this platform, Latin American and Caribbean platform for climate justice, can serve as this foundation. And, sorry, the sound is really bad. It's very hard to understand. What we expect to happen, particularly in the regions that are more tropical and have these tropical impacts, and that the climate change at some point will, of course, lead to forced displacement. and that there should be a legal framework of protection when it comes to this forced migration due to these impacts. Sorry, I think the internet connection, unfortunately, is not very good. Yeah, that was Martin. Thank you. Okay, Carolina then. Yes, I would identify two resistances at the global level that is like this guideline that the future can be ours and that we need alternatives. For example, we being feminists and ecological activists. So these are the two resistances because both are being very straightforward and frank and questioning the economic power, patriarchal power, political power, and also ancestral contexts, because there are, of course, patriarchal structures in our past that are rooted very deeply. And that we can express that both these resistances will not always be naturally linked, but there is, of course, also then the challenge how to bring them together, how to connect this feminist and this ecological root. So the crisis, of course, not only an environmental crisis, it's more a crisis of civilization, I would say. It's all about the for humanity to survive. It's not about the planet. The planet is going to survive for millions and millions of years, but humanity is just only has evolved recently, if you want. So we need to move from human in the center to the planet in the center. And what is the alternative? I believe that the rural communities do teach us a lesson that we don't need to exploit nature in order to live a decent life. Historically, this has happened, and in this spirit, in this philosophy, we also need to redefine consumption and consumerism. That is, of course, not compatible with the biocapacity of Mother Earth, Madre Tierra. So thank you very much to the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation for maintaining this connection with Latin America. Thank you so much. Thank you for the thoughts you've shared that are very deep and that will keep us thinking and reflecting upon these topics. So as we're running out of time, we're going to wrap up our meeting, and much love to our colleagues in the offices, Luxembourg offices in all these different places, and then of course also to everybody participating in the climate justice program and the dialogue series. And we will continue the dialogue. Thank you so much for participating via Zoom or Facebook. And we're going to show a little video clip to close our session.
I don't really know how I survived, but I know why my family died. My name is Joanna, and I come from Tacloban. We were at ground zero. I lost my father, mother, brother, sister-in-law, and 3-year-old nephew to the storm. My story is repeated many times over. Because of climate change, extreme weather events are happening globally with more intensity and frequency. More and more communities are displaced and forced to move in search of safety and security. had to leave the land of our birth, our ancestors' graveyards. We leave our way of life and go to a place that is new and unfamiliar to us.
We are the world's first community to be displaced by climate change. Good day. I am Helen from the Carteret Islands in Papua New Guinea in the Pacific. Our homes, farms, schools, they are slowly sinking. We cannot grow our own food anymore, and so we had to leave. The sea has taken back our islands. The new place where we were brought to was a landlocked bush far from the sea. We are fishers. We know nothing about farming. We even have to walk 6 kilometers to school every day.
Our farm animals died, and we were also getting sick because there was no water. Assalamu alaikum. I am Kalia from Syria. We love our country, but it's nearly impossible for us to survive if we stay. It hasn't always been like this. Our family's farm was planted with cotton crops that were always thirsty for water. The crisis brought by drought contributed to violence that led to war. There wasn't much help from the government. We left the farms to look for work in the nearby cities, but there were no jobs available. We sold everything we had so we can pay boats to bring us to Europe. It's really scary. When we got to Europe, they turned us away. They said we can't stay there because we didn't have papers.
We have been walking for 2 weeks. I am very tired and my feet are full of blisters. Hola, I am Juan Patricio from Honduras. We left after the floods. Sometimes it gets very cold at night. During daytime, it's extremely hot. My mother says if we keep walking for 2 more months, we can reach Mexico and then the US. I hope they don't kick us out of America. I hope they understand our situation. When I was in school, I remember how we talked about human rights, the United Nations, and how people should help each other out.
Human rights are rights inherent to all human beings, regardless of race, sex, nationality, ethnicity, language, religion, or any other status. Human rights include the right to life and liberty, freedom from slavery and torture, freedom of opinion and expression, the right to work and education, and many more. Climate change adversely affects our human rights, especially for us who are already in vulnerable situations.
But why is it that when we move to other places, it seems like we do not have rights at all?
We, migrants, lose access to basic necessities.
Governments acknowledge climate change migration. We do not need just acknowledgement. We need commitment. We need justice. Rich countries and corporations are the greatest offenders in causing climate change. And yet the poorest countries and communities are the ones taking the worst impacts.
They should take the initiative to solve the problems they caused, because it's the right thing to do.
They said they would help, but actually they now ask us to pay for an insurance fee for when our crops are damaged.
It's not fair that they continue to benefit while we suffer. This has got to stop. This has got to change.
We started as victims, but we are also survivors.
We ask rich nations and corporations who are responsible for these to own up and pay up. We will sue those who are responsible for climate plunder. We demand official passports and refugee visas for displaced climate migrants. We ask that governments not to drive us away and respect our human rights.
We demand an international law on climate migrant rights.
We will continue to pressure governments, agencies, and institutions.
We have the right to move. We have the right to live in dignity.
We will not wait to die.
We are fighting back.
We are fighting back.
We are fighting
We
back.
are fighting back.
We are fighting back.
Helps us, of course, to illustrate our discussions. And last not least, this is an invitation that goes out to cooperate in drafting a document that our colleagues Laura Geiger and her colleagues, I don't know, Laura, whether you want to invite our participants.
Yeah, thanks everyone for this really interesting discussion. And Carla said already and summarized it really well. So I don't want to repeat that. The only thing I wanted to point out, since that was mentioned several times, that we need, and Carla mentioned that also, how can we connect? How can we create these alternatives? So there is a platform she mentioned for the Latin American team, but additionally, there's also the opportunity, since I mentioned this in the beginning, that from these several webinars, the 3 we have in total, there will be an outcome report produced by Tetet Laurent. She's also on the call, but behind the scenes, as there were some people, very important people behind the scenes. And if you're interested in, please get in touch with her or with me. The email address is in the chat, and this outcome report serves hopefully as a basis for a submission for the Global Compact on Migration, to really use the possibilities, the little opportunities we have to raise the voice also in international frameworks, as this is one as part of the UN. And furthermore, all the products, there will be several products from these sessions, quote cards, the recordings, because we will definitely share the recording with other colleagues. Today, not so many colleagues could participate, but thankfully for the internet and the technology, we can share this. And so we also invite you to check the website. We will also follow up with you, and you will get an email for the products which will be produced. So the website address specifically for the topic on climate migration, you have also in the chat video. So thanks again to everyone. Thanks to Carla. And I give back to you for the final words.
Bueno, pues las palabras finales. De nuevo.
Okay, to wrap this up then, thank you very much to all of you. And we will certainly meet in other spaces in the future, to the interpreters and also to our office team in Manila. Thank you so much. That's it for today. Enjoy the rest of the day and see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.